Okay, so Fiona, it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Um, there's lots of places where we can take this conversation, and I'm excited to see where we can go. And I notice you have the statue. It looks like a Buddhist statue behind you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, can you give us a bit of uh, context to what the connection of that is for you and in your office space? Or
Sure. So actually, we touched on it slightly before we started before we started recording, just about the importance of having places that you go to for reflection in your life, if you like. So, and one of the places that I like to be able to have that is my office. So, things that I have in my office are quite intentional. So, the Buddha statue, some of my clients laugh. They're like, "Is that to make?" Because for people who can't see me, it's behind my shoulder, and they laugh as they think, because I coach a lot of kind of senior execs, and they're like, "Is that to make us feel calmer?" And I'm like, "No, no, 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 no. That's to make me feel calmer." So things like that are in my office for, I suppose, what is the space I need to create for me to turn up in the best way for myself and clients. I suppose what's more pressing, and probably the reason that you asked, is that my research when I studied psychology, when I returned to college, and I'm sure we will get into the whole rigmarole of how did I leave one career and start another. I did my research into spirituality, and in particular into people who consider themselves to be spiritual but not religious. And obviously, that's a growing cohort globally. It's something that we're seeing double digit growth in over the last 10 to 15 years globally. So spirituality is something that's quite important to me, nurturing my spiritual sense, nurturing my sense of connectedness. I think that that is really what's central to spirituality. It can be anything that you want it to be. Maybe you do yoga, maybe you pray, maybe you spend time in nature, but how do you nurture connection and connectedness in your life? So the Buddhist symbol, I've had it years. I've had it about 20 years. It was always in even when I worked in investment, it was always in my bedroom. So there was always, I think, even something unconscious in me that was quite drawn to how do I cultivate peace and connection in my life beyond how I was poorly doing it before, if you get that. So that's a very long way of telling you why is there a Buddha statue in my office, but I guess it's a reminder for myself. I see it as soon as I walk in the door every morning. And one of the first things I do when I come down to my office every day is I meditate. So yeah, and I am as imperfect as everybody else, so I have to have a little reminder in my office that I need to do that before I start working.
I love that. There's a lot that I love about that. I mean, when your clients are asking, is that to remind us to be at peace? It's like, no, this is
Yeah.
for me.
This is
And
for me, but if it helps you, that's fine too.
yeah,
So,
I mean, that's such a humanizing thing to be able to say because in doing this type of work, when we're holding space for others, it's very easy to be put on a pedestal by someone
mm,
and to put ourselves on a pedestal. And I think it's a lovely reminder that we need to fill up our own cups with connectedness or peace. And
yeah.
I was even down in Greystones this morning and I called into the Happy Pair for a coffee and I was talking to the
Okay.
general manager and he said,
Mm,
I went down for a swim before work today and he said he was just chuckling to himself in the car on the way because, God, this is like a free piece of life for me.
yes,
Um,
absolutely.
he's a dad, he's a manager, he's busy, and there's people kind of pulling and dragging out of him in all areas of his life in a lovely way, and that's just the way his life is set up. But that little moment of a swim in the morning was his little piece of peace, and it helped me to kind of reflect on the importance of filling up our own cup and
hmm
having those moments for ourselves. And yeah, I just love that little anecdote about with your clients.
And I think what any coach or psychologist would tell you is we're our first client. Often our entry point into this has been, how can I live a better life? How can I know about myself well? And I would still consider myself, like any people who read my Substack regularly would say, Fiona's constantly writing about how her life speeds up and then she has to intentionally slow it down again. So I am very far from perfection. What I am is much more intentional about my life than I used to be. But you can't turn up for your clients. You can't. I think that you need to get the dual thing. You need to be minding yourself so you can be the person who can hold space for your clients. And then I think you also need to be the peer of your client. As you said, the idea of putting any coach or psychologist on a pedestal is a bad idea. For any of your listeners, we're as imperfect as everybody else, but also that you are meeting the person and being able just to have real conversations about, like, life is hard and it's busy and we're all struggling and we're all trying to live better, and I'm still trying to do that. I'm probably more informed than most people because of what I do for a living, but I'm far, far from perfect. So reminders, that's why ritual and ceremony have always been so important for people. So the general manager talking about the fact that he's going for a sauna is the same as somebody else going to mass on Sunday. You know, it's what are the markers you're putting in your life to remind you to have a moment of freedom, which having a swim can be, or going to the sauna can be, or me reminding myself to meditate. So I center myself. I have a habit of going too fast, so I have to put those kind of markers in my life to stop myself doing that. And it's a practice like anything else.
Yeah, and I was speaking to a friend yesterday and I asked him to come on the podcast and he said yes, but not now because he's learning that when momentum builds up for him, he needs to be able to put his foot on the brake at times so he doesn't crash. And I just
Yeah.
really respected that. And that no piece, I know there's a famous marathon runner who says vitamin N,
Hmm.
where can we say no to protect our own energy,
Yes,
protect our own.
100%. Yeah.
So there's a lot of things coming up there that would be interesting to explore. Words you use like connectedness, peace, intention, freedom. And I think a nice prism to discuss that would be the study that you did.
Sure.
And can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So, I think it's funny when you decide to research spirituality, you get different reactions from different people because, for people who obviously won't have heard of me before, I spent 20 years working in global investment. So, and when I decided that I wanted to make change and I returned, I made the decision I'm going to go back and study psychology. I'd always wanted to do that. And I'm going to do a research study into what does it mean to people who are over 35, because I was over 35 at the time, who consider themselves to be spiritual but not religious. I mean, we talk about spirituality, and then I suppose the analyst in me or the researcher in me, given my background, was like, what does that even mean? You know, like, and that's a question I tend to bring to a lot of my work. When people say you should do this or you should do that, and I'm like, what does that even mean? And specifically, rather than don't give me a definition, tell me what that looks like in your life. So I used a research method, which I think that you also used in your research as well, was the phenomenology of something, which is what is the lived experience of this in your life. So I don't want you to define spirituality for me. I don't want you to tell me it's this rather than it's that. I don't care about any about that. I want Brian, or who, in my case, the different participants that I had, to tell me what I start with that question, and then we're just going to let the conversation go what it goes. And I want to understand, what does this mean to you? What does it look like in your life? What do you do with it? Why do you consider yourself to be spiritual but not religious? So that's basically what I did. And it was an absolute gift to myself because I'm a total super nerd, and I basically got to indulge myself around this topic for, the guts to 6 to 9 months, which is how long it takes to put together a research project like that. Um, and I was very much, which is kind of my personality, entering this with that we don't need more definitions. And I was very open to the fact that I would interview these people and they would all have completely different stories to tell me. And the biggest shock for me, what came out of it, was that yes, everybody has their individual story, but the themes that came out of the research were almost universal. And that wasn't my intention going in. I almost had this idea that I'm going to go in and say, spirituality can mean whatever you want it to mean, which it can, don't get me wrong. But actually, the meta themes that people discussed in different ways in their life were the same four themes. The first was a deep sense of embodied connection. So, this idea that they didn't see God or the universe or a life source or whatever. There was about 10 different names that people called what traditionally we would have called God, from God down to there's a life within us, from as definitive as that down to I just feel that there is life beyond me, if you like, there's something beyond me. And they had this deep sense of inner connectedness to this. It wasn't that, going back to your idea of putting things on a pedestal, it was that this is residing within me, this life force is residing within me. And because they had a relationship that they cultivated through, again, practice, and that for some people was I swim in the sea every day to connect to nature. For other people, it was I pray. For other people, it was I walk in nature, whatever it is. I do yoga, meditation. They had different practices. Their sense of connection to themselves was higher. So that was kind of, that because they were creating the time for connection, they had a deeper sense of connection to themselves. And as a result, it kind of provided almost this foundation or platform to their life, which allowed the other themes to be there. So connection was, I would not say that all of the themes had equal weight. Connection was like this foundational thing. It was like the ultimate theme that emerged. And out of that, these people demonstrated higher or greater meaning and purpose in their life. They had this great sense of why am I here? My life has direction. I understand the significance of my life here. Deep, deep authenticity, and they were all felt that they were walking a path of trying to be the most authentic version of themselves. And I suppose the end line of my research project was that those three things, this deep sense of connection, being able to create meaning and purpose in their lives, or being able to talk about their life coherently, and feeling that they were walking the path towards greater authenticity, meant that all of these people were demonstrating the traits of what Maslow would have called self-actualization. So this kind of understanding spirituality and having the connection that they desired in their life allowed them to actualize their potential in life. Um, so that was kind of the outcome, I suppose, was what were the benefits of spirituality, which wasn't necessarily the question I asked at the start, but I suppose that that's what these people, just through speaking to them, were able to demonstrate in their own life.
That is absolutely fascinating. I'm so happy that this podcast is facilitating these kind of conversations.
For you.
Yeah, for me selfishly, I mean, and what I find is following that thread of curiosity has been really useful
Yeah.
for the podcast.
Yeah.
So I
And
hear,
purposeful for you to use my own word.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I hear embodied connection, a pra
Sure.
a practice that facilitates that connection.
Yes.
Then that gave them a sense of meaning and purpose, and then a path of authenticity in their life.
Yeah, so I would just use slightly different language around it, that having this sense of embodied connection and a practice that allowed them to connect to that gave them the tools to cultivate meaning and purpose in life, if you
Yeah,
like. So they had this sense of I'm connecting deeply to whatever I consider this life force to be. Therefore, I connect deeply to myself, and that allows me to make sense of my life in a better way. I believe something about the universe around me, whatever that might be. I believe something about my place in the world, and therefore I have the ability to cultivate a narrative, which that's what meaning and purpose is. What is the story I tell myself about my life? And I'm able to navigate the hard parts of life because I have this belief of where I belong and where I fit. So it was a really deep tool for people, and I feel this myself in my own life because that is how I feel about my own life as well.
yeah, it's interesting language you use, which I really like. The story we tell ourselves about our life.
So it's the truth, you know?
So,
That's what
and
I
you,
mean. I can tell you what I absolutely believe. And do I believe that there is a power greater than me? Yes, I absolutely believe that. You don't have to believe that to have meaning and purpose in your life. It's easier. That's what the research tells us, that people who have spiritual inclinations have higher meaning and purpose in life. All of the research has documented that. But then you could come back to me and say, well, the story you tell yourself about your life, Fiona, isn't what I think it is. But it doesn't actually matter what Brian thinks it is. It matters what Fiona thinks it is, and how I cultivate that story so I have coherence, which is a key pillar of meaning in life, is that I feel like my life makes sense. I feel like I belong somewhere. I feel like I have significance. They're all things that matter. And then at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether Brian agrees with Fiona's life story. The only thing that matters is that I think that this is what is happening here, and that propels me in the direction I want my life to go.
yeah, coherence is such an important word. It reminds me of that thing people say, everything happens for a reason, or what's for
Sure.
you
Yeah,
won't
yeah.
pass you by, which sometimes sound like throwaway comments or tropes, but having a deep sense that like you'll learn from different experiences and it's bringing you somewhere is so important, especially
Yeah.
when going through difficult times of overwhelm or where things feel,
Like they don't make sense.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
which we all have moments like that where I'm not sure why this particular thing is happening to me right now, but I trust that at some point in the future I'll be able to make sense of this, and I trust that I can get through this. So there's what you were saying there about everything happens for a reason. They sound like old wives' tales, but that is how people have made sense of their life for like millennia. Um, and what has happened to our society in the last 50 or 60 years. And to be clear, I mean, I have no beef about, hey, whether people consider themselves religious or spiritual or neither. And that was one of the reasons I did the study, was because I consider myself to be spiritual but not religious. And I had I suppose growing up in Catholic Ireland, I had certain issues about religion, I suppose certain elements of religion. So I'm very clear that, and my research question was, what does spirituality mean to you? Because I like to sit in that place of Fiona makes sense of her life this way, Brian makes sense of his life that way, and we have agency around that. But I suppose I digress slightly. One of the issues that we still have, because we've become such a secular society, we've lost these sense-making abilities that we had before, which was everything happens for a reason. Like, it sounds like a throwaway comment, but it has provided people with sustenance around this terrible thing has happened in my life, or, and particularly for a lot of people, like in times gone by, there was a lot of poverty, and but their deep sense of community and sense making that they had through their religion provided them with the resilience that they needed to move forward with their life. And we have this kind of dichotomy in modern society where our lives have got better, but our sense of meaning and purpose has fallen, if you like, So a lot of my work, and I don't always speak around spirituality, it depends on who's interviewing me or who I'm talking about, is, we're we're dying for purpose. We are looking for a sense of meaning and purpose so much. And we have lost some of the traditional tools that we had. We don't necessarily have to use those if we don't want to, but we have to find something. Otherwise, what is like life becomes meaningless, then we need meaning. We need to be able to create meaning no matter how we do it.
Yeah, connectedness there. I mean, recently we had Ava McMahon on, who was a singer with Celtic Woman, and she runs a
Hmm.
Celtic World Forum, which brings people together around Celtic music. And we
Hmm.
released a video on social media of a clip from that conversation. And she said, we're starved of connection in
Yes.
life often, which reminds me of what you're saying. And I notice myself being drawn to ways where I can authentically connect with people, whether
Hmm.
that's clients, colleagues, family, friends, and even a conversation with someone the other day, even going maybe too far down the road of authenticity and seeing
Hmm.
other people with judgment and then no longer being able to connect with them wherever
Yeah.
they're.
Which is, I see it a lot. It's something I've had to work on myself, and I see it with clients as well, where you go on this path of personal growth, and then you want everybody else to get on this path of personal growth because it's been so fruitful for you, and you have kind of become more of who you can be, if you like. And it creates friction with other people in your life sometimes, that you either have people who become your total cheerleaders, or you have people that are like, what do you mean you're going to do that with your life? You can't do that. Like, that's, you're breaking the box. Like, just pick a box and be in it. And then part of your own growth, and certainly this has been in my life, is don't judge that person. If you're judging that person, you're still in your own shadow as well. So the real goal is that you're walking your own path in life and you don't care what anybody else thinks, whether they have a good opinion of you or a bad opinion. That is the hardest thing you'll ever have to do.
Yeah.
And judging somebody else on whether they're being authentic enough or not is still your own, is it your own stuff to work on. It's really hard, like personal growth is really difficult. It's just constantly another door that you have to walk through.
Yeah. My good friend Jack Kavanagh all often says, new levels, new devils,
Yeah. Very good. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And yeah, I remember coming back from the Camino to Santiago when
Sure.
being evangelical about the experience that I had
Yeah,
to
of course.
everybody that would listen. And I remember my sister saying to me, like, you're going to have to stop because you're going to alienate everyone in your life.
Yeah,
Because,
yeah, yeah.
and you mentioned my research, my master's thesis, which was
Hmm.
through the prism of philosophy and sociology, but it was studying pilgrimage as a rite of passage to our
Hmm.
authentic self
Sure,
in
beautiful.
contemporary society because
Hmm.
we've lost a lot of those pillars to find that.
Hmm.
And I had this incredible mind-opening connected experience on the Camino
Hmm.
that I did when I was going through a massive identity shift in my life.
Hmm.
And when I came back, I had to understand it. So
Hmm.
I went in to my master's thesis just with the question, what the hell was this thing that I just
Yeah,
experienced?
exactly. Yeah.
And then a more specific question emerged once I saw what research and where the gaps were.
Yeah.
And where we kind of landed on with my supervisor was the reintegration portion after the
Yeah.
transformational experience. How do you actually put that into everyday life? Because I've met many people who did the Camino then every year for 10 years. And I didn't want to live that life either. I wanted to
Mm.
bring that new self into the life that I want to live.
Hmm.
Um, and, that intersects the corporate world and
Of course.
spirituality. And I think that was a question that I felt called to ask you was, can you tell us how that research project, when you did your degree in psychology,
Hmm.
intersects with the work that you do now with your
Sure.
clients?
So when I decided to do the research into spirituality, I'm going to give you a slightly long answer here, but I think it'll be
Right.
helpful. Helpful. You sit back and relax. It'll be helpful for people. So, like, I'd had an incredibly corporate job. I had worked in investment, and then I had been working with institutional clients all over the world. So it was as hard data as it was going to get. And when I went through a similar experience, when I decided to resign, I didn't have a clear plan, and I was just due to go on. I was due to go on retreat about 3 weeks later. I had booked it, and I had a very expansive experience when I was there, similar to what happened to you when you were in pilgrimage. And unfortunately, in society, and this is one of the kind of the problems that we have, is if that had happened to either of us 100, 200, 1,000 years ago, there would have been an elder in the community who says, your consciousness is effectively expanding. This is what is happening here. And your sense of identity is expanding. And we are going to, help you integrate those new parts of yourself which you're now coming into contact with. None of that exists. So your version of that was to do a thesis, and my version of that was to do a thesis as well, which is just interesting. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to have to go and research this for myself because I've changed. It's interesting how you came back and you were telling everybody about it. I had a very, like, what we would call a mystical experience. I went on a vision quest. I was fasting. I was in the desert on my own. And I had a very mystical experience, a very heart-opening experience. And I told very few people when I came back because I thought everybody's going to think I'm nuts. So I went off and I did my master's and kind of did all this research and was able to integrate what had happened to me in a way that served my identity, if you like. And I would consider myself, I was always a very, I'm quite as I've called myself already on this podcast, quite a super nerd. And something that has definitely happened to me in the last 7 years is I'm able to use my heart and my head together. And I think that that's something we lack in modern society as well. How can we use our intellect and use kind of the heart's wisdom to make better choices in our life, in work, and society, and so on? But one of the main, I never went into the research thinking, what am I going to do with this? So comments I got at the time were, this is not a commercial topic, Fiona, particularly because you've had such a commercial career before, yada, yada, yada. And for me, that was just, I knew enough about myself that that's the wrong question. That's the wrong reason to do a research study. You should do a research study because it's hard work on something that you're interested in and you feel can contribute to your own life and the life of others. And don't get caught up on, I'm going to monetize this. And I think that that is something that we get really wrong in modern society is we confuse purpose and monetization as the same thing, that sometimes you will do things because they serve you. And then in as a result, you will go on and serve yourself and others better. Not necessarily with that, but because of that. One of the main themes, as I've discussed already, that came out of this was meaning and purpose. So everybody I spoke to, and then obviously, as you know, when you do a research study, if a theme comes out of it, you need to go off and study that theme as a result. So I ended up doing a vast amount of research into meaning and purpose, so I could include it in my research study and my final publication. And then kind of I exit my master's, I get my research published, and then I'm back into, okay, well, what am I going, because I had taken time off to return to college. What am I going to do now? And over time, it just became more and more evident to me that our understanding of purpose was completely broken. Again, for some of the reasons we've already discussed, and also because there's a lot of cannibalization of purpose within our working lives and within corporates. This is, I suppose, my view, that we've tried to take what we are seeing as this growing desire for purpose, and we've tried to say, okay, here's a purpose statement, and that's what we do, and you're going to find your purpose working with us, and that is very the shallow end of the pool when it comes to purpose. So what I'm a big believer in is not that I did this before and now I do this now, how, again, going back to identity, how do I use all of who I am in my work? So obviously I've worked at a very high level of business. I've done that globally. I'm used to speaking to sophisticated audiences. And I was like, actually, I want to do something around leadership, and I want to do something around purposeful leadership, because for me, that is the missing piece, that organizations don't have purpose. The people that are in organizations breathe life into purpose, if you like. So one of the things I talk about is that purpose is inherently human. So we need to work with people around what is my identity? Who am I? How do I want to show up in the world? And how am I using that intel to deliver as the purposeful leader in my community, in my life, in the organization that I have? So very long answer, but over time, it became clear to me that this research that I had done would be useful for me in terms of how I worked with leaders going forward. And I had always done a lot of speaking work, and I knew that I wanted to do a lot of, like, I suppose, thought leadership and speaking work around the idea of we make purpose real. It's not some statement that we have. It is about expanding your identity. It is about understanding who you are and how you want to show up. And that I could use my knowledge of the business world along with this research that I had done to really put it out into the world in the ways that I'm good at, which is writing and speaking. So that was a long answer, but I hope it kind of made sense in terms of how did I go from doing a study on spirituality to actually doing a lot of work on purposeful leadership today.
Brilliant. Can you expand a bit on how that looks?
Sure. So I suppose there's three business lines that I have, and they all kind of inform and reinforce each other. My primary business line is keynote speaking, so I speak at typically leadership events, town halls, depending on the size of the company, and then sometimes kind of bigger leadership events where there you would like a summit, for example, where you would pay to go. So some of them are in-house and some of them are kind of bigger external events. And I speak on a number of topics. What is most popular is I speak on purposeful leadership. So I have a keynote that's called Purpose is a Choice. So again, going back to this idea that it is not some statement that we have, purpose is a choice that we make every day. It is about how we show up, how we choose to have courage, how we choose to stand up for the things that we believe in, and ultimately, do we have clarity on who we are, and how we want to make purpose real? Because I think there's a lot of sorry, I'll finish this point and then I'll get on to what else do I do. But I suppose I'm trying to bust some myths around purpose. There's a lot of, you're either evangelical about purpose or you're cynical about purpose. They're the two types of people that I tend to meet. And often neither of those groups have clarity on what purpose really is. So one of the things that I talk to about when I meet business leaders, either whether it's in a small group or a big group, is that we make purpose real. You're cynical about purpose because you think it's some statement that your marketing team has put together. But like that's just a statement. That's nothing. We make purpose real. So if you're a leader in an organization, that purpose statement will only become real through the choices and decisions that you and the rest of the leadership team make. So for me, we need to, own purpose in a greater way. Own what we say, either purposes in our lives or purposes in our organization or our community. So that's kind of the mainstay of some of the speaking work that I do is around that topic and different versions of that speech, if you like, depending on the audience that I'm speaking to. Um, Alongside that, I coach two groups of people, purposeful leaders, so those who identify as being purpose-led in their work, and also what I term self-actualizers, so people committed to, I suppose, a path of growth. In reality, those two people are the same because if you consider yourself to be a purposeful leader, you also are probably committed to your personal growth. And if you are committed to your personal growth, you're probably on top of that quite purpose-led in your approach to life and work, if you like. So they tend to be the same type of person, but one might be a CEO and the other might be coming to me for personal coaching and maybe is at a mid-level of their career. And then the last thing I do is I have a Substack newsletter, which I think that you've read some of them in preparation for this. And I write essays on all of the things that we are talking about today. So one week I could be talking about, myself going on pilgrimage. Another week I could be talking about something to do with purpose and leadership. And, I wrote an essay last year on, we need more purpose-led investors, for example. So again, how am I combining my knowledge of one thing with my knowledge of another? And I publish those every month. They're open access, and I feel quite strongly about that because accessibility, I think, is, an attribute of the purposeful leader. How do we make our work, our abilities more accessible in the world? But I'm also aware, profit and purpose have to coexist. I have bills to pay just like everybody else. So I charge for most of my work, but this is a way of me making my ideas and, some of the ways that I think that we infuse purpose into our life more accessible for people. And I do that through through my Substack community. So I suppose that that's almost my B2C offering, if you like. But all of those, as I hope it's clear, reinforce each other. What I'm writing turns up in my keynotes, a conversation I have with a business leader after a keynote makes me think, and I might go away and write an essay on it. And they all kind of reinforce each other. And a lot of people I coach or people that have hired me, so CEOs or, chief people officers who've hired me end up subscribing to my Substack, so if there's general interest in my work, there's kind of three ways to access it.
Yeah, and we talked about this before. Our podcast for Essential
Mhm.
Training is kind of like your Substack. It's
Exactly, exactly.
when I came into the business 2 years ago full time, even though I've been in and around it since I could walk and talk. That
Mhm.
had me at with Wyatt with their leadership team teaching
Sure.
CEOs to juggle when I was like 4 or 5.
Very good.
Um, and I actually have a set of juggling balls here. I bought them today for a workshop I'm doing on Friday with one of our
Brilliant.
clients.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Well, we do juggling because it's like learning how to learn. How do
Mhm.
you approach learning and something difficult
Very
uh,
good. Yeah.
and why did I mention that? I can't remember. Well,
You were talking about the podcast being like my Substack. It's kind of,
exactly. And when
yeah.
I came into the business, it was like I could see the impact we were having on individuals and
Mm,
organizations, but like, how can we get that to more people? How can we expand
exactly.
that to more people?
And that's service. Sorry to interrupt you. That is like, how am I of service beyond making money? And I don't want to downplay money because I am like, as a business, if you don't exist if you're not making money. So you can't have purpose as a business unless you're making money, because you literally don't exist. So the two things can coexist. I'm not anti making money. I'm very pro making money, but I think that you can also be of service. So if I look at and I talk about this, like the epitome of purpose is how am I of service to others? That's real purposeful leadership, is how am I of service to others? So when I even look at my Substack, it was again, it's a service point, it's an accessibility point. How can I reach more people? On a completely selfish note, it's also about my purpose. One of the things that I do really well, I hope, you can tell me afterwards if you agree, is I write and I make complex topics very accessible for people. It was one of the reasons that I used to speak and speak to investors so much when I worked in investment because I have very strong communication skills. So I can do that in my Substack. Obviously, I do it on stage, but I can do it on my Substack. But from a completely selfish perspective, I also love to write, and my Substack gives me a channel for that. So I'm guessing if we asked you about this podcast, yes, you're reaching a bigger audience. It is also PR for the business, all of those things. But Brian is personally getting something out of this. I've no doubt about that.
100%. And
Yeah.
I love that question, how am I of service to others? And as you were saying that, and you already answered it, it's like, how can I also be of service to myself and how
Self.
important
They
that
have
is.
to coexist. They have to coexist because otherwise you'll just burn yourself out trying to. You have to. It goes back to what we talked about at the start. You have to be able to fill your cup up, and also you're entitled to enjoy your work. You're entitled to do things because they feel good. It feels good to me. I love nothing more than I've made a commitment to publish one essay a month, and I love nothing more than when I press publish and I go off and make myself a cup of tea, and there's just such a good feeling of that, that sense of accomplishment that I took something. And usually when I'm writing, I go through this kind of arc at the start where I'm like, oh, this is great. And I'm halfway through it and I'm like, oh my God, this is terrible. And then eventually I make it work. And I'm the same with my keynotes. So for me, I get so much joy out of pressing publish to them and saying, I took this thing, it was hard to get it going, and then I finished it. And that's only for me. Nobody's writing me a check for that. It's literally for me. But what it does is it puts structure and form on my work in service of other people. Because I could just sit here and, contemplate my navel and think about all of these things, and I would get something out of that. But how can I take all that contemplation and struggle and trying to make sense of my own life in the world, and how can I give it to other people freely so they can perhaps find that interesting as well? And the last reason I wanted to do it, sorry, and then I'll stop pontificating, is that life is busy. And I recognize not everybody has I suppose, the resources or the opportunity to do some of the contemplation and work that I've done. But if the only thing they do is read one essay that I write every month, it is a centering point, a moment of connection, something for them to kind of think, oh, actually, maybe I do want to think about this more. The same way I'm sure that somebody somewhere is out listening to your podcast once a week while they're having a walk, and it's giving them time to reflect on where their life is and what they're doing. So for me, there's a real feel-good factor for me in terms of the fact that I'm making that available to people as well. So again, a
Love,
long answer. You can tell I speak for a living, Brian. I'm not
yeah.
short on words.
No,
So
there's so much in there. And we had Mary Fahy on the podcast, who we collaborate with, and she does
sure,
breath. Uh,
beautiful.
and one of the things that she said was the importance of, well, the importance of like the mind body connection is
Hmm.
massive. And why we love working with people like Mary is we can work on the psychological side, the emotional side, the holding a safe space, and then we can tap into the mind body connection. But one of the things she said that I loved is when she does corporate workshops, she's not saying, "Oh, come join me and leave your job and go start your own business and go on this wellness journey." It's like, no, use what we're learning here in your life. And
100%.
that's what I
You
hear
can
about what you're
live
saying.
better, work better, all of that. Yeah, yeah. And one of the things I say when I'm on stage is, it's very easy to think that like the grass is greener and I'm going to go off and I'm going to do this other thing. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do to be more purposeful is look at the job you're doing and the organization you're in today and think, how can I have a bigger contribution here? And that doesn't mean necessarily that it's I'm have more success, more promotions, all of those things. How can I use the power of my situation? And this is something that I think we often miss. And when I look back at my previous career, I had so much more power than I was allowing myself to have. I had access to some of the biggest investors in the world. I worked for an organization that had loads of power. I would have considered myself a very confident person. I definitely was like, always pushing for the next promotion, the next thing that I wanted to take on. But did I use my power well to have greater impact in the world? Now I do that. I'm not sure that I did that well before. So, like, purpose is not just about what we do, it's also about how we use our power and how we use the power of business. And I feel quite strongly about that because I've worked in it for so long. Business is a very powerful tool to affect change in the world. And regardless of whether you're the CEO or the head of function or whatever, you can look at what you're doing and think, how can I be more impactful here? That is a question you can ask yourself. And with the tools like Mary is saying, some of that's how can I lead a better life, but some of that is how can I take an hour every week to think, okay, there's a job I have to do, and then there's impact I can have, and how can I be intentional about that? And that's much more powerful than some purpose statement that we write that we don't mean or we don't enact, if you like. But how can I look at the position and the power I have and do something meaningful with that?
And is that purpose-led leadership?
Purposeful leadership for me is how am I using my power within and my power and position to have a greater impact on myself, others, and society. If I was to define it, and it's real clarity on what you're here to do, it's real clarity on who are you and what are you going to do. And it's really easy to be, I suppose, to point the finger and say, oh, the CEO's not doing nothing, or the CEO's not doing enough, or Brian's doing nothing, or anything like that. But like most of us have agency in our life. So, how are we going to use the power that we have in whatever way that is? That could be within our community, it could be within the organization that we're in. Maybe it's something that we do outside of work. But who are we? How do we want to show up in the world? How are we going to use the resources at our fingertips to do something? Because no one else is coming for us, like nobody else is going to solve all the problems of the world. This is on us. And that was one of the major drivers for me making a shift was I had a moment of clarity where I was like, I'm very talented, as many people listening to this podcast are, I'm sure. And what am I going to do with that beyond society's definition of success? It's not enough for me. I want to do more than that. And when I'm on stage, my big thing is I want to encourage other people to think like, what are you going to do? How are you going to use the power and the position that you have to have an impact?
Yeah, what are you going to do with this one precious life?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, like what is your legacy going to be? What is your contribution going to be?
And as you were speaking earlier, and you mentioned Maslow and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I
Sure,
remember first coming across that in leaving cert business and
sure.
seeing and being fascinated by it. And, at the bottom of the pyramid, I'm sure lots of people are aware of it, but if you're not, there's like food and shelter and safety. And then
Hmm.
as you move up the pyramid, you move towards self-actualization, which is
Hmm.
a fulfilling life of meaning and purpose. And
Sure.
we have a very similar kind of what we call the coaching arrow in Erickson coaching, where you
Sure.
move someone through that arrow to a more actualized life. And
Sure.
recently, in the last year, I saw the pyramid inverted,
Hmm.
which I really liked, saying that actually self-actualization and authenticity and purpose are actually vital. And it's a way to look at it in another way that, yes, we need food and shelter and to pay the bills and all those things, but actually sometimes a meaning and purpose can help us get up in the morning to do all those things.
All of that. Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is that Maslow actually didn't come up with the pyramid. I don't know whether a lot of people don't know that because it's still universally used. A consultancy company came up with it in the 70s. Maslow never saw it as in I have it's not like a computer game where I have this and then I have that. He saw them as reinforcing parts of the psyche and the personality in life, which makes more sense based on what you're saying, you know? So if you think about me, like I obviously have a lot of expertise in meaning and purpose, but it doesn't mean I'm sitting up on top of the pyramid looking down on everybody else going like, whenever you're ready, guys, come on up here. Like that's not the way life works. There are still gaps in my life that I'm constantly trying to fill in. So he would have seen it in more of a circular spiral nature that we're trying to spiral higher in terms of our consciousness and our search for wholeness and our search for authenticity. And he would have seen authenticity and self-actualization as the same thing actually. So you're on this path to become the person that you were destined to be. Um, so that's the first thing I think. I think it's more helpful to see it in that spiral. So as if my coach was here, she would say I spiral around the same topics all the time, which many people do. And sometimes I even say to myself, Jesus, I'm back here again, like discussing this topic because we all have the things that trip us up all the time. So for me, it's more helpful to see that I'm spiraling closer to maybe not talking about this in coaching forever or whatever it might be. So they tend to reinforce each other, and it doesn't mean we can be on a path to self-actualization and still have gaps in our life around, where we need more love, more connection, all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's the first thing I'd say about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The second thing I would say is, though, that we live in a society where, and this is where I can understand that people get frustrated around meaning and purpose. We live in a society that's moving too fast. So, it's very hard to live in urgency culture and to be trying to raise your kids and make ends meet and everything like that, and then find the time to sit down and self-actualize. It sounds like, okay, that sounds lovely, but I'm over here in the reality of my life where we have a cost of living crisis and I can't get childcare for my children, and everything is so expensive. And Fiona's on a podcast with Brian and they're talking about self-actualization, and I completely agree with that. How on earth can you carve out the time to be more meaningful and intentional in your life when society has set you up to fail at that? So things that were, let's call them the bottom of the pyramid as we know it, safety. Traditionally, we should be so beyond people having safety needs at this point, but we're not because people are struggling to try and make all parts of their life fit together. So, as a society, and business again plays a big role in this, how can you expect people to have meaning and purpose if they're working 70 hours a week, if they're working at speed, if we have this urgency culture where they always have to hit these targets, or everything has to be delivered by Friday, and we all know it doesn't really make any difference if it's delivered on Monday. So this kind of constant speed and this narrative that more is always better, it's completely, I suppose, in parallel or in conflict with the idea that you want to become a version of yourself where you're fully expressed, you're in wholeness, you feel self-actualized. So again, another long answer to a question, but on one side, we have to look at self-actualization as a different concept, and the other side, we need to do something from a societal perspective because life is too busy and people are just struggling just to make ends meet, to live well, to look after their children. So there is a kind of a societal responsibility around if we want people to become who they are destined to be, if we want people to have the tools to self-actualize, there's bigger questions we need to ask ourselves about, what are the supports we're putting in place for that? Because it's all very well me and you talking about it. We do it for a living as well, but that doesn't take away from the fact that, there are impediments for us in general in terms of achieving that.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot there. That's brilliant. I mean, the sense I get is there's a linear nature to life now that hasn't always been there. And
Exactly.
that linear nature, it sounds like that company mapped that to this pyramid, this hierarchy of needs that
Yeah,
actually was not what Maslow intended. It's more
not at all.
interdependent.
Yeah,
And, talking to a client recently who had a massive realization that they were sprinting in a certain direction
yeah,
and had a wake up call when a friend passed away that they were sprinting in a direction that was 180 degrees or 90 degrees away from where they actually wanted to go.
yeah.
So it gave them a bit of a wake up call.
Yeah, no, 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 for sure. And let me, for anybody listening today, I was a total sprinter, so I was very much, I'm a woman on the way up, so, and I was very, very driven and very linear. And it at some point it just didn't serve me anymore, and somewhere inside me I knew that I had to disrupt this, and that's why I went off and did a master's, and I kind of went on retreat and talked and thought about these things. It's really hard to do that because you have to give up caring what other people think, that success as it is defined by society is not necessarily what success looks like for you. And I struggled with that at the start, because I had got very accustomed to being very linear in terms of, there's a straight road and I am sprinting down that road and I'm going to get to the end before anybody else almost. Um, and I had to disrupt that in myself if I wanted to have a more purpose-driven life, effectively. And I wanted to expand myself as a sense of self and do all things like I carve out 2 days every month to write my Substack, that maybe nobody else cares about it but me, but I do care about it. And it's really hard because in society we've decided more and up and higher is the only definition of success that you can have. And the analogy I often use was that I was living my life as if I was the mega star movie star, where I only did, big, you have the choice that you can only do big movies and you get paid a lot of money. Where actually I want to be the person who does an indie movie this year, a blockbuster movie the next year, and Broadway the following year. I wanted more texture and more interesting ventures in my life. And that meant that I couldn't have, it doesn't mean I can't have it all the time. Some years I can have it, but I couldn't have blockbusters every year because I wanted to carve out, time and effort in my life to be very intentional about the things that I did in my career. So I don't know whether that metaphor makes sense to you, but it was a disruption of blockbuster good, everything else bad in terms of what, and because ultimately my life, I'm more connected to myself and my life has so much more meaning and purpose than it had 10 years ago. But it doesn't mean that people don't still say to me, I don't understand what you're doing. I don't understand why you did that. They say it to me all the time. And going back to your point earlier about, how you're pointing at someone else, telling them they're not being authentic. My work is to not care. It's not, my work is not to argue with them and say to them, I'm doing it because of X, Y, Z. My work is to work on the part of me that still might care about what they think about my life choices. So,
And Brené Brown has an amazing exercise where you get a little sheet of paper, 2 inches by 2 inches, and you write all
sure.
the people's opinions who you value there.
Yeah.
And and if you're unsure about something, you can ask one of those people or all of those people and anybody else's opinions you don't care about. So
Yeah.
because I think there's is a balance between not caring and also having sense checks from people who you love.
100%. Yes, absolutely.
And in
And I have a
saying that,
small group of people who I'll ask their opinion. What do you think of this? Absolutely. But it's a tiny, tiny amount of
it's
people.
tiny. And I remember one of the people on that list when I went and walked the Camino when I was 22, 23, they were like, "You're mad. Go get an internship." But
Yeah.
now they
Yeah.
look back and they see the value in it. Um, yeah, yeah. I'm just thinking of a group of leaders we'll be with in the next 2 days from one of our big clients
Sure.
and a very successful organization
Hmm.
going a million miles an hour. They really
Hmm.
genuinely care for their people and they invest in their
Sure.
people. And this workshop is about helping them connect on a human level in
Hmm.
order to achieve better results, but in a different way, maybe than, as you said, society sometimes, you know, avoiding burning people out or burning bridges, doing it
Yeah.
in a way where it's, holistic and people have family lives and they can still be successful. And
Hmm.
that's the sense I get doing this work is I kind of want my cake and eat it too. Like I
Mhm.
want the purpose and I want the meaning and I want the service and I want a certain standard of life
Yeah.
for myself and my family and I want to be able to contribute to organizations
Mhm.
that are doing that as well.
Yeah, and I think that that should be available, you know. So even when I think about it in my own life, you know, sometimes I have to, and I use inverted commas for anybody that can't see me, you know, you have to sacrifice something, you know? So sometimes I have to, you know, sacrifice work that I don't feel is purpose driven. Other times I have to sacrifice my time because I absolutely want to do 4 events in 2 weeks, and that's going to make me tired. I can't do that every 2 weeks, you know? So it's all about like what is so something I often ask people when they come for coaching with me is what will success look like for us, you know, as me being the coach, you being the coachee, what will success look like? What are we trying to do here? So we're kind of our contract is around what does success look like. So for any you as an individual, then what does success look like? I want to earn a certain amount of income every year. You know, I have bills to pay and a certain standard of living that I like as much as anybody else. And to do that requires hard work. That's true of any work that you do. The fact that I enjoy it doesn't take away from the fact that some mornings I'm up at 6 o'clock in the morning because I need to write a keynote because I'm delivering it next week. You know, that's just life. There's no, I haven't found the way around that, you know. Do I feel that that is very purposeful for me because I know I'm going to deliver it and I'm going to do that with passion and I really believe in the work that I do? Absolutely. Is it still sometimes a slog? Absolutely. Like, you know, so that I think that you have to reconcile in your head that if there's, well, certainly if there's utopia, I haven't found it, you know? So, but it's really important that when you're slogging, that you understand the purpose of the slog, you know? And I think where people get into burnout is they stay in careers or organizations that they do not enjoy, and then they're slogging with no sense of or attachment to meaning and purpose in what they're doing. And that is the road to burnout, and it's not a fulfilling life. You might be paid a lot of money, but there are hundreds of companies all over the world. You could go and work for them and earn money and probably attach more meaning and purpose to what you're doing as well. So again, I go back to intentionality in terms of, you know, what am I trying to do with my life? You know, I have to earn money. That's just the that's the economic reality of being alive. You have to earn money. How am I going to sit on the axis of those two things where I can, you know, attach meaning and purpose to what I am doing and I can also earn money so I can live joyfully and peacefully and with a sense of contentment in the world. And you should be able to have those two things. And again, that goes back to some of the points we have big society questions to ask ourselves like, as well about, you know, more and more people should be able to do that. And I think that we have some questions to ask ourselves about what are the societal impediments to that as well. But that's probably perhaps another version of this podcast too.
Yeah.
So
And you know, I'm conscious as we speak about something like this with what's going on in like the Middle East and what's going on in and you know in Russia and Ukraine and you know in no way do we get political with this, but it's often a question that comes up for me because there's such pain in the world and it seems to be that is even more important to be living a joyful, purposeful life when things like that are happening to help drag us through and towards a world that we want to live in.
yeah. So I think the first thing is that we're definitely in a moment when there's so much polarization going on that responsibility of purposeful leadership, whether you are the intern or the CEO, is the call is for us all at this point. You know, it's not just because you were in a higher position of power. There is a call to us all to ask, how are we, who do we want to be and how will we live? Because that offsets some of the other people who are making choices that I don't find quite so palatable. And some of our political leaders in the world currently would be examples of that. So we have to offset that by deciding that we want to stand up and lead in a better way, regardless of whether that is in our family, our communities, or our organizations. And alongside that, we have to insist on joy somewhere in our lives. You know, like what is the point if we don't also have joy and happiness? Because, you know, purpose can be a stick to beat ourselves with, where we just need to constantly like be, how am I of service to other people? How, and I believe in all of those things. But what is the point if you are also not joyful in yourself? Because then you'll be a joyful person to be around. Like I personally don't want to work for the CEO who doesn't know how to live life beyond his or her work as well. So I think we have to insist on both who am I going to be and how am I going to lead in this world, regardless of how big or how small. And also that I insist on a life that brings me joy. Whether in my case it's writing a Substack or hiking at the weekend, your case it's doing your podcast or, sauna, spending time with your friends, that we have to have outlets like that to live and connect and be the people that we are supposed to be.
Amazing. Amazing. I'm so happy with what we've covered so far. Uh, I just think there's something in there for everybody. I mean, I feel like there's a lot in there for me personally, especially where I'm at in my life and my career, and a lot of the clients that we work with, friends and family who listen to this podcast. Hopefully for your audience too, there's a lot there. And as we think about coming towards the end of this conversation, I'm wondering what are some of the things that you might have that you'd like to speak about that maybe we haven't touched on yet, or something you'd like to expand on, or maybe there's not anything and I can ask another question, but I kind of want to give you the floor and make sure that we cover.
Thank you. I think I have so much to say that it's often hard for me to like say, is there one statement that defines Fiona English? I don't think that that's true. I think there are a number of different topics which I write about consistently, and they are purpose and purposeful leadership, authenticity and wholeness. I write probably less about spirituality than I did a few years ago, although it tends to infuse my work in terms of the sense of connectedness that I feel and the sense of connection that I encourage other people to find. Um, I could go off on a tangent about where I see politics globally, but honestly, I'll just bore everybody to tears, so I won't do that. There's nothing I really feel that, we haven't covered, but if I was to encourage people to do anything, find an hour in your week and get intentional about who am I and how do I want to show up in the world and how does that play out for my family, for the role that I play in my organization, for the people that I lead, and for, the legacy I want to leave behind. And they sound like big questions. They're questions of identity ultimately, which is core to my work. But your contribution can be big or small and it won't go unnoticed. So, spend some time and ask, look around the world today and just say, who am I and how do I want to show up? And it doesn't matter then afterwards whether you do that in a small setting or a large setting, because the only way we change the world is by each of us changing and doing something about it. So, and then it depends on the platform or the position that each of us is gifted in terms of how much impact we can have with that. But
Yeah.
that's it really. We can do a million offsites, we can do all the coaching that we want, but ask the question and get intentional and do something about it. That's basically it.
Yeah. Questions like who am I? How do I show up in the world? And how does that affect the people around me?
Yeah.
And how do I want that to be? And am I happy with it? Would I like it to change?
Yeah. And
And
like everything, you start with small changes, Brian. Like, as we both have kind of gone on our own journeys of how do we end up here. I didn't wake up one morning and go like this is all clear to me and I'm so clear about what I'm going to do. That didn't happen for me at all. It happened to me over a number of years, but I was intentional about moving forward all the time and about unlocking more and more of who I could be. And then the universe, I find, just presents you with the opportunities to show up that way. Presents you with the challenge often about, well, you say you're this, here's the challenge for you to really show that. But if you can just make the intention to always be moving in that direction, I think that, the opportunities find you and your life just expands. Your life just expands. I talk about that a lot, that, once I got my head and my heart talking, my life expanded in a way that I just didn't expect.
mm, amazing. What an amazing message to leave everybody listening. So thank you so much for coming on and having the conversation.
Thank you so much for asking me to be here.